Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. And honestly, if you think about it, the fact that we're about to spend the next little while discussing something called the Void Era should tell you everything you need to know about how deeply confusing ancient Mesopotamian chronology can be. Because when the Sumerians sat down thousands of years ago to record their understanding of time itself, they weren't particularly concerned with making things easy for modern historians who would one day be desperately trying to figure out whether we're talking about actual historical periods or elaborate mythological frameworks. And the tablets themselves, these fragile clay records that survived floods and fires and the general decay of millennia, present us with numbers so staggeringly large that scholars have been arguing about their meaning for over a century now. Which brings us to the Void Era, a period that supposedly existed before the Great Flood, before kingship descended from heaven, before anything recognizable as human civilization took root in the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The temples of ancient Sumer rose like artificial mountains from the flat alluvial plains, ziggurats constructed from millions of mud bricks, each one stamped and dried in the relentless Mesopotamian sun. And within these sacred structures, in cool interior chambers lit by oil lamps, priests maintained their records, their king lists, their astronomical observations, their accounts of grain and livestock, and yes, their grand narratives about the very beginning of time. Because if there's one thing the Sumerians understood, it was that authority derives from antiquity, that the older your claim to power, the more legitimate it becomes. So when a king wanted to justify his rule, he didn't just say he was chosen by the gods last Tuesday. No, he traced his lineage back through impossibly long genealogies, through dynasties that supposedly ruled for tens of thousands of years, through the Void Era itself, that mysterious time before the flood when, according to the tablets, kings reigned for spans that would make Methuselah look like he barely made it past infancy. Now, you probably won't survive this, not because ancient Sumerian chronology is actually dangerous, though I suppose you could theoretically hurt yourself if you dropped one of those heavy clay tablets on your foot, but because staying awake through a detailed discussion of antediluvian kingship duration is one of those uniquely soporific experiences that humans probably aren't meant to endure while conscious. Which is precisely why we're here, why you've chosen to let my voice carry you through the darkness while we explore the absolutely riveting question of whether the Void Era lasted 8 generations or 80,000 years, or perhaps existed in some entirely different temporal framework that our modern minds simply aren't equipped to understand. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because the last thing I want is a subscription from someone who's going to wake up tomorrow morning with deep regret about their late-night YouTube choices. Though I suppose if you're here for bedtime history about Sumerian chronology, you've probably already made several questionable life decisions that led to this moment, which is absolutely fine. We're all friends here, all fellow travelers through the weird corridors of ancient mystery. If you're listening from somewhere in the world right now, maybe leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is, because there's something genuinely wonderful about the fact that someone in Tokyo and someone in Toronto and someone in Tasmania might all be falling asleep to the same discussion about clay tablets from 4,000 years ago, as if we're all gathered around a digital campfire, sharing stories about the deep past while the present moment spins on around us. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, because we have a lot of ground to cover, or rather, a lot of time to cover, which when you're discussing the Void Era could mean anywhere from a few centuries to several 100,000 years, depending on which tablet you're reading and which scholar you're asking, and whether or not you believe that the ancients were recording literal history or engaging in elaborate numerological theology, or perhaps just having a bit of fun with posterity by making up numbers that would confuse the hell out of archaeologists millennia later, which honestly wouldn't surprise me, because if I were an ancient scribe and I knew that my words would survive thousands of years, I'd probably throw in a few curveballs just to keep things interesting. The Sumerian king list, one of our primary sources for understanding ancient Mesopotamian chronology, presents us with a fascinating puzzle wrapped in an enigma pressed into clay, and this document, which exists in multiple versions discovered at various archaeological sites, begins with the extraordinary statement that kingship descended from heaven, which is already quite a way to start a historical record, because modern history books don't typically open with, and then leadership came down from the sky, though perhaps they should. It might make them more interesting. The king list then proceeds to enumerate the rulers who held power before the Great Flood, and here's where things get wonderfully, bewilderingly strange, because these antediluvian kings supposedly ruled for terms that stretch credulity beyond the breaking point. We're talking about reigns of 28,000 years, 36,000 years, 43,000 years, numbers that make you wonder if perhaps the Sumerians were using a different definition of year than we do, or if they were counting months or seasons or lunar cycles, or if they were just really bad at math, which seems unlikely given their sophisticated mathematical systems, or if, and this is the interpretation that makes some scholars wake up at 3 in the morning in a cold sweat, they actually meant what they wrote, that there was indeed a time before the flood when beings ruled for incomprehensible spans, though whether these beings were human or divine or something in between remains a matter of considerable debate. The mainstream historical fact that we can anchor ourselves to here is that the city of Eridu, mentioned in the king list as the location where kingship first descended from heaven, was indeed one of the earliest Sumerian settlements, with archaeological evidence of occupation dating back to around 5400 BCE, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Mesopotamia, and the tablets themselves, the actual physical objects that transmit this information across the millennia, were created using a technology that revolutionized human civilization, the technology of writing, specifically cuneiform, which emerged around 3400 BCE and allowed humans for the first time to record information outside the fragile medium of human memory, to freeze thoughts and facts and stories and lies in clay, making them theoretically immortal, which is either the most beautiful or most terrifying invention in human history depending on your perspective. Now here's where we encounter our first scholarly debate, because when you present an ancient historian with the claim that kings before the flood ruled for tens of thousands of years, you basically get three camps of interpretation. First, you have the literalists, who are increasingly rare in academic circles, but who maintain that these numbers should be taken at face value, and that something genuinely strange was happening in the antediluvian period, something that allowed for these extraordinary lifespans, which leads down various paths involving different atmospheric conditions or genetic differences or divine intervention, all of which makes for fascinating speculation but difficult peer-reviewed publication. Second, you have the mathematical reductionists, who argue that the Sumerians must have been using a different time-counting system, that years actually meant something else, perhaps months or seasons, and if you divide these enormous numbers by 12 or 60, you get more reasonable reign lengths that fit better with what we know about human biology and political stability, which is a neat solution except that it requires us to believe the Sumerians were somehow confused about their own calendar system, which seems condescending. And third, you have the mythological interpreters, who suggest that these antediluvian kings weren't meant to be understood as historical figures at all, but rather as theological statements, as ways of expressing the vast gulf between the world before the flood and the world after, between the time of the gods and the time of humans, which is probably the dominant view in contemporary scholarship, but which also means we're essentially saying the ancients made it up, which, fair enough. Humans have been making things up since we learned to make sounds, but it does leave us with the unsatisfying conclusion that we can't really answer the question of how long the Void Era lasted, because it might not have existed in any temporal sense we would recognize. Let me tell you about the Weld-Blundell prism, because if we're going to discuss Sumerian chronology, we might as well get acquainted with one of the most important artifacts in this entire mysterious business, and this object, which resides in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, is a clay prism about 8 inches tall, a four-sided piece of fired clay covered in neat rows of cuneiform writing, and on this prism, inscribed sometime around 2170 BCE, we find one of the most complete versions of the Sumerian king list, and you have to imagine the scribe who created this, sitting in some Mesopotamian city, probably Lhasa based on the archaeological context, carefully pressing his stylus into soft clay, reproducing a list that was already ancient by his standards, copying names of kings and cities and reign lengths that stretched back to a time before the flood. And what was he thinking as he wrote these enormous numbers, these reigns of 30,000 years? Did he believe them? Did he wonder about them? Did he maybe chuckle to himself and think, well, this is clearly nonsense, but it's my job to copy what's in the old texts? Or did he accept them with the same faith that might lead someone today to accept equally extraordinary claims from ancient books? And here's a joke for you, though whether it's funny depends on your tolerance for academic humor. How many Sumerian scribes does it take to confuse modern historians? And the answer is apparently just one. One scribe with one prism and a complete lack of concern for the methodological anguish he would cause 4,000 years later. The Void Era, according to the schema presented in the king list, encompasses 8 kings ruling in 5 cities before the flood, and if you add up their reign lengths, you get a total that varies slightly depending on which version of the text you're using, but which generally comes out to somewhere between 241,200 and 456,000 years, which is, let's be honest, quite a long time. Geologically speaking, we're talking about a period that would extend back beyond the emergence of Homo sapiens. We'd be into the realm of earlier hominids, of Neanderthals and Denisovans, and various other extinct branches of the human family tree. And obviously the Sumerians didn't know about evolutionary biology or paleoanthropology. They had no way of knowing that their chronology, if taken literally, would place kingship descending from heaven at a time when the beings to receive it weren't quite human yet in the modern sense, which creates a rather delightful paradox, though perhaps the Sumerians would have found it less paradoxical than we do. Perhaps their conception of time and origins was simply more fluid, more willing to accommodate contradictions that our more rigidly empirical minds struggle to accept. There's a quirky, fringe interpretation that I should mention here, not because it's widely accepted in academic circles, in fact it's thoroughly rejected by mainstream scholarship, but because it represents the kind of creative thinking that the ancient chronology problem has inspired, and this interpretation suggests that the Void Era kings weren't humans at all but rather alien beings or advanced pre-flood civilizations that possessed technology and lifespans far beyond our current capabilities. And look, I know how this sounds. I know we've entered the realm where serious historians start backing away slowly while making excuses about needing to check their citations, but the interpretation exists. It's out there in the popular consciousness, appearing in books with embossed golden covers and documentary series that play dramatic music over shots of pyramids. And while we can dismiss the literal ancient aliens aspect, there's something interesting about the impulse. Behind this interpretation, the desire to make the numbers mean something, to find a framework where 28,000-year reigns make sense, because the alternative, that these numbers are purely symbolic or simply wrong, leaves us with a kind of intellectual dissatisfaction, a feeling that we're missing something important about how the ancients understood time and history and their own place in the cosmic order. The scholarly debate around this reaches into questions of numerology and Mesopotamian mathematics, because the Sumerians used a sexagesimal system, base 60, which is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour, and some researchers have noted that many of the reign lengths in the antediluvian period seem to be related to 60 or its multiples in interesting ways, which might suggest that these numbers were chosen not for their historical accuracy but for their mathematical or cosmological significance, embedding abstract truths about time and divinity into what appears to be a straightforward king list, which would make the document something like a mathematical poem disguised as a historical record. And honestly, the more you think about it, the more you realize that the distinction between history and mythology wasn't nearly as clear in the ancient world as we like to pretend it is in ours. Even though we still tell ourselves plenty of mythology and call it history, we just do it with better footnotes and peer review. Now, let's talk about the flood itself, because you can't discuss the Void Era without addressing the event that supposedly ended it, and the Great Flood appears in Sumerian literature, most famously in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim tells the story of how he survived the deluge by building a boat and filling it with animals and his family. which might sound familiar if you've encountered certain other ancient texts from the region, and scholars have long noted the similarities between the Mesopotamian flood narratives and the biblical story of Noah, and there's a whole fascinating discussion to be had about the relationship between these texts, about borrowing and transmission and independent development. But the point here is that the flood serves as a crucial dividing line in Sumerian chronology. It's the event that separates the Void Era from historical time, the moment when, according to the tablets, everything changed, when the impossibly long reigns ended and kings started ruling for more mundane periods of decades rather than millennia, and you can interpret this division in various ways. Maybe it represents actual environmental catastrophe. Archaeological evidence suggests there were significant flooding events in Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE, though nothing that would match the universal deluge described in the texts. Or maybe the flood is a metaphor for cultural transformation, marking the transition from purely legendary material to something approaching actual historical memory. Or maybe, and this is the interpretation that keeps graduate students up at night, it's all elaborate fiction designed to give ancient dynasties an air of impossible antiquity and divine sanction, which would make the Void Era the world's oldest and most successful marketing campaign for monarchical legitimacy, a story so effective that we're still discussing it thousands of years later, which is honestly pretty impressive as far as propaganda goes. You have to respect the craftsmanship. The question of how long the Void Era lasted becomes even more complex when you consider that different versions of the king list provide different numbers. Because ancient texts weren't mass-produced with perfect fidelity, each copy was made by hand, and scribes made errors or corrections based on their own understanding or the requirements of whoever commissioned the text. So we have versions where certain kings are included or excluded, where reign lengths vary by thousands of years, where cities appear in different orders, and trying to reconstruct the original king list is like trying to reconstruct a telephone message that's been passed through a chain of speakers spread across 2,000 years, some of whom were partially deaf, and others of whom had their own agendas about what the message should say, and this textual variation means that any statement about the duration of the Void Era comes with implicit footnotes and caveats. It means that certainty is impossible, that we're always dealing with ranges and estimates and scholarly best guesses, which is frustrating if you came here expecting a simple answer, though if you came to a bedtime history video about ancient Sumerian chronology expecting simple answers, I have to question your understanding of how any of this works. Here's another joke, and I promise these will be scattered throughout like raisins in bland historical bread. What did the Sumerian scribes say when asked how long the antediluvian period lasted? And the answer is, give me a moment to check my tablets, and also, what's your definition of year? And also, are we talking literal history or theological framework? And also, who wants to know, because my answer might vary depending on whether you're the king or just some random peasant asking awkward questions, which admittedly isn't the snappiest punchline, but it does capture something of the genuine ambiguity in the sources, the sense that even the ancients might not have agreed among themselves about what these numbers meant, and scholarship has to grapple with that ambiguity rather than pretending to a precision that the sources don't support, which is harder than it sounds because humans crave certainty. We want our ancient texts to tell us clear truths, but the universe, and especially the ancient universe as mediated through fragmentary clay tablets, is rarely so cooperative. The city of Eridu holds a special place in Sumerian cosmology and in our attempt to understand the Void Era, because according to the king list, this is where it all began, where kingship first descended from heaven, and the tablets tell us that the first king was Alulim, who ruled for 28,800 years from Eridu, which is either the most boring reign in human history, imagine the endless council meetings, the centuries of paperwork, the millennia of ceremonial duties, or it's a statement about something other than actual political history, perhaps a way of saying that Eridu represented the eternal beginning, the source point of civilization, which would make Alulim less a historical figure and more a personification of primordial kingship itself, the Platonic ideal of a ruler unfolded across an impossible time span. Archaeological work at Eridu conducted primarily in the 1940s and more recently in the 21st century, has revealed layers of occupation stretching back to the Ubaid period, making it genuinely ancient even by Mesopotamian standards, and the site includes temples built and rebuilt on the same spot across millennia, each new structure constructed directly on top of its predecessor, creating an artificial mound, a tell, composed of the collapsed remains of human devotion. And there's something poetic about that, about the way the physical city grows vertically through time, accumulating layers like tree rings, each stratum representing a moment when people decided to honor their gods in the same place their ancestors had, maintaining continuity even as everything else changed. And in a sense, the city itself becomes a physical record of duration, not the impossible 28,800 years claimed for Alulim, but still impressive, still ancient enough to deserve its reputation as the first city, the place where civilization crystallized out of the void, which brings us back to that term, the void era, because void suggests emptiness, absence, nothing, but the era we're discussing was supposedly full of kings and cities, and presumably all the usual apparatus of human society, unless by void we mean something different, something like the void before creation in Genesis, the formless empty space that exists before God speaks things into being, in which case the void era might represent not actual emptiness but rather the period before historical consciousness, before memory took root, before the past became knowable in any systematic way, which would make it a void not of events but of records, not of experience but of documentation, and that's a very different kind of emptiness, the kind that haunts historians, the awareness that most of what has happened is lost, that we're seeing only the tiniest fraction of human experience, the bits that happened to get written down and happened to survive and happened to be found and happened to be translated, and all the rest, all the daily life, all the ordinary moments, all the people who never made it into any king list, they've vanished into the void from which the void era supposedly emerged, which is admittedly getting pretty metaphysical for a history video, but these are the kinds of thoughts that arise when you're contemplating 28,800-year reigns at 2 in the morning. Everything becomes fluid, boundaries dissolve. You start wondering whether there's any real difference between history and mythology and fever dreams induced by staring too long at cuneiform tablets. The second king in the Eridu dynasty, according to the standard version of the king list, was Alangar, who ruled for 36,000 years, which is somehow even longer than his predecessor's reign, and you have to wonder about the political dynamics here. Did Alangar stage a coup after waiting around for nearly 29,000 years for his turn? Was there an election? Did kingship descend from heaven a second time specifically for him? Or are these numbers telling us something about divine rather than human time? The kind of time that operates on cosmological scales, and here's where another scholarly debate comes in, because some researchers have suggested that these antediluvian figures represent not individual kings but entire dynasties, that Alulim might actually be shorthand for the Alulim dynasty which ruled Eridu for a long but not quite 28,800-year period, and if you average out multiple rulers across centuries, you get numbers that, while still impressively long, start to seem at least theoretically possible, though this interpretation requires reading against the text, which clearly presents these as individual reigns, and scholars generally prefer not to insert meanings that aren't explicitly there unless absolutely necessary, which admittedly doesn't stop them from doing it when it suits their arguments, because interpretation is always partly about imposing modern categories on ancient material, trying to make the past speak in ways we can understand, even if that means occasionally putting words in its mouth, or in this case, pressing additional meanings into the clay. The thing about Sumerian tablets that you have to appreciate is their physical presence, their thingness, because we're not talking about digital files or even paper documents. We're talking about chunks of clay that someone had to mine and process and shape and inscribe and fire, objects with weight and texture and smell. And when you hold one of these tablets, assuming you're an archaeologist or curator with proper training and authorization and not just some random person who wandered into a museum storage room, you're holding the actual physical object that the ancient scribe held. Your fingers are where their fingers were. You're connected across thousands of years through this shared tactile experience, which is about as close to time travel as we currently get. and the information pressed into these tablets is permanent in a way that most modern media isn't. A clay tablet properly fired can last basically forever. It doesn't degrade, doesn't become unreadable, doesn't require any particular technology to decode beyond a knowledge of the language, which means that in some ways, cuneiform tablets are a more reliable storage medium than anything we've invented since, certainly more reliable than magnetic tape or hard drives or whatever cloud storage system you're trusting with your photos and documents, all of which will be obsolete and unreadable within a century, while clay tablets from 2000 BCE are still perfectly legible if you know how to read them, which is a funny kind of progress. We've gotten better at creating information but worse at preserving it. We're drowning in data that will all vanish within our lifetimes, while the Sumerians, with their primitive technology and ridiculous chronologies, managed to speak to us across 4 millennia, which suggests they understood something about time and permanence that we've forgotten in our rush toward digital ephemera. Now, here's a quirky detail that appeals to a certain type of person interested in ancient mysteries. The Sumerian word for year is mu, which is also the word they used for name, which has led some fringe theorists to suggest that the enormous reign lengths in the king list aren't actually measurements of time but rather counts of something else, perhaps ritual iterations or calendar ceremonies or namings of some kind, which would make Alulim's 28,800 years actually mean that his name was recorded or invoked or celebrated 28,800 times, which at one invocation per day would work out to about 79 years, a perfectly reasonable reign length, and this interpretation has the advantage of making the numbers work without requiring us to believe in impossible lifespans or alien interventions or mistakes in the historical record. The disadvantage being that there's no textual evidence for this reading. It's essentially making up a meaning for mu that fits our modern sensibilities better than the straightforward translation of year, which might be clever but isn't quite honest. And this is the eternal tension in ancient studies, the balance between respecting what the text actually says and imposing interpretations that make it more palatable or understandable to contemporary audiences. And different scholars fall at different points on this spectrum, some insisting on the most literal readings even when they produce absurd results, others freely reimagining ancient intentions to align with modern knowledge, and somewhere in that middle ground is probably where the truth lives, though pinning it down is like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. You know it's there, you can see it, but every time you close your fist, you find you're holding nothing but the memory of something that was present just a moment ago. The third city mentioned in the antediluvian section of the king list is Bad Tibira, which means the fortress of the copper workers, which gives us some actual economic history to cling to because we know that copper metallurgy was developing in this region during the relevant period, and the king list says that 3 kings ruled from Bad Tibira for a combined total of 108,000 years, which is quite a long time to be working with copper. You'd think they'd have figured out bronze by year 50,000 or so, but apparently these things take time when you're ruling on a cosmological timescale. The 3 kings were Enmen-Lu-Ana with 43,200 years, Enmen-Gal-Ana with 28,800 years, and Dumuzid, who the text describes as a shepherd, with a modest 36,000 years. And there's something touching about that detail, that even in this list of impossibly ancient rulers with impossibly long reigns, someone thought to note that Dumuzid was a shepherd, as if his profession mattered, as if it told you something important about his character or his legitimacy. And maybe it did. Shepherds appear frequently in ancient Near Eastern royal ideology, from biblical David to various Mesopotamian kings who styled themselves as shepherds of their people. So maybe the scribe was indicating that even before the flood, even in the time when kings ruled for 36,000 years, there was already this metaphor, this understanding of kingship as a form of pastoral care, which is either a beautiful continuity of human political thought or evidence that the whole list is a back projection of later ideas onto an imaginary past, depending on how cynical you're feeling, and at this hour, your cynicism levels might be fluctuating wildly. Everything seems profound at 3 a.m. Even the extremely boring details of Sumerian administration start to take on a numinous quality. as if they're revealing secrets of the universe rather than just being the remnants of ancient bureaucracy, which they are. The Sumerians were nothing if not bureaucratic. They invented writing largely to keep track of grain and beer rations, which is honestly the most relatable thing about them. If we'd invented writing today, it would probably be to track pizza deliveries and streaming subscriptions. The medium changes, but human concerns remain fairly constant across the millennia. Here's another mainstream historical fact to anchor ourselves with. The Sumerian civilization developed one of the world's first writing systems, and their astronomical observations were remarkably sophisticated. They tracked the movements of planets and stars, predicted eclipses, developed mathematical systems that we still use today, so when they recorded these impossible chronologies, they weren't primitive people randomly making up numbers. They were mathematically literate astronomers and bureaucrats with complex calendrical systems, which makes their recording of 28,800-year reigns even more puzzling, because you'd think such careful observers of celestial time would have a pretty good handle on human time, on the fact that people don't live for tens of thousands of years, unless, and this is key, they weren't trying to record human time at all. They were encoding something else, some other kind of knowledge or meaning that we're missing because we're reading their texts through the wrong lens, expecting them to be proto-historians when they were actually theologians or mythographers or poets of time, working in a genre that doesn't map neatly onto our categories of history versus fiction, fact versus myth. And maybe the question, how long did the Void Era last, is itself malformed. Maybe duration isn't the right way to think about this period. Maybe it existed in some other dimension of meaning that our temporal vocabulary can't quite capture, which sounds mystical but might just be accurate. The ancients didn't think like us, didn't divide reality the way we do, and their chronologies might be operating according to principles we don't fully understand because we've lost the cultural context that would make them intelligible, which is a long way of saying we don't know and maybe can't know. But at least we can admit that, at least we can be honest about the limits of our understanding rather than pretending to certainties we don't possess, though that honesty doesn't make for very satisfying narratives. People want answers, want to know exactly how long the Void Era lasted, want a number they can put in a textbook or a documentary or a bedtime history video, but sometimes the most accurate answer is "it's complicated," which is the historian's version of "it depends," both of which are deeply unsatisfying responses that nonetheless reflect the genuine ambiguity of the evidence. The city of Larak comes next in the sequence, and here's where the king list assigns just one ruler, Ensipazi-Ana, who gets 28,800 years, and you'll notice that this number keeps recurring. 28,800 seems to be a significant figure in the antediluvian chronology, and scholars have noted that this number is related to important astronomical cycles. It's close to the length of time it takes for certain planetary configurations to repeat, which has led some to suggest that these reign lengths are actually encoding astronomical data, that the king list is partly a mnemonic device for remembering important celestial periods, which would make it an entirely different kind of document than we've been assuming, not a historical record at all, but rather a mathematical or astronomical text disguised as a king list, which would be very clever and very Sumerian. They loved embedding multiple meanings in single texts, puns and wordplay, and hidden layers of significance, and if you were trying to preserve important astronomical data in a pre-paper society, encoding it in a memorable list of kings might be exactly the strategy you'd employ. Make the numbers meaningful in one context, historical, while having them serve a completely different function, astronomical, in another context, and this kind of double coding might help explain why the numbers are so large and so specific. They're not trying to fool anyone about actual reign lengths. They're serving multiple purposes simultaneously, which is the kind of sophisticated textual practice that makes you respect the ancient mind. They were doing things with writing that we're still trying to figure out 4,000 years later, which either means they were very clever or we're very slow, probably both. And there's something humbling about that, about confronting texts that we can read but can't fully understand, where every word is translatable, but the overall meaning remains elusive, like a joke explained so thoroughly that it stops being funny, except in this case, the explanation makes it more mysterious rather than less, which is the opposite of what explanations are supposed to do. but welcome to Ancient Studies, where answers generate more questions, and the more you know, the less certain you become about anything. The penultimate city of the antediluvian period is Sippar, identified with the sun god Shamash, and the king list gives it Enmendur-Ana, whose name means something like Lord whose divine powers are lasting, which is appropriate given that he supposedly ruled for 21,000 years, and there's a tradition that Enmendur-Ana was a great sage who received wisdom from the gods, which appears in later Babylonian sources that describe him as the seventh of the Apkallu, the seven sages who existed before the flood and brought civilization to humanity, and this connection between Enmendur-Ana and the Apkallu tradition opens up yet another layer of interpretation, because if these antediluvian kings are actually mythological figures associated with the transmission of divine knowledge, then their long reigns might represent not temporal duration, but rather the timeless quality of wisdom, the sense in which certain truths are eternal and transcend ordinary human lifespan, which would make the chronology theological rather than historical, a statement about the divine origin of Sumerian civilization and the supernatural foundation of royal authority, and this interpretation has the advantage of taking the text seriously on its own terms rather than trying to reduce it to either bad history or good fiction. It tries to understand what the Sumerians were actually doing with these numbers, what work they were performing in the cultural imagination, and that work might have been establishing a cosmological order, creating a narrative framework that connected the present moment to a primordial past, giving contemporary institutions like kingship and temple worship a pedigree that extended back before the flood, before history, before time itself in any normal sense, which is exactly what you'd want if you were trying to legitimize your political system. You'd want to show that it wasn't just some recent invention, but rather a restoration of ancient practice, a reconnection with the way things were in the beginning, in the Void Era, before everything went wrong and had to be washed away and started over, and the flood serves as that great reset button, that moment when the cosmos was wiped clean and reorganized according to divine plan, and everything that comes after the flood is living in the shadow of what came before, trying to recapture something of that original order even though the conditions that sustained it no longer exist, which is a profoundly melancholic view of history, the sense that we're living in diminished times, that the glory days are behind us, that the best we can hope for is imperfect approximation of antediluvian greatness. And maybe that's why the Void Era kings get such enormous reign lengths, because the text is expressing through chronology what it can't say directly, that we've fallen from a greater state, that something was lost in the flood that can never be fully recovered, that time itself has become corrupted, shortened, less stable than it was in the beginning, and if you take that reading seriously, then the question of how long the Void Era lasted becomes almost irrelevant, because the point isn't the actual duration, the point is the contrast, the way the antediluvian numbers make the post-diluvian reigns look tiny by comparison, establishing a before and after that structures all subsequent Sumerian historical thought, and that's a much more sophisticated use of chronology than we typically credit ancient texts with, which says more about our prejudices than about their capabilities. The final antediluvian city is Shuruppak, famous as the hometown of Utnapishtim, the Sumerian Noah, and the king list assigns it Ubara-Tutu, who ruled for 18,600 years, and with Ubara-Tutu's reign, we reach the end of the Void Era, because he's the last king before the flood. His reign ends when the deluge comes and washes everything away. And there's a narrative elegance to this structure, beginning with Alulim in Eridu and ending with Ubara-Tutu in Shuruppak. 8 kings in 5 cities, a complete cycle before the reset, and if you add up all their reigns in the standard version, you get 240 years, though some versions give different totals, and this number, 200, is divisible by 60 in interesting ways. 214,200 divided by 60 is 4,020, which is probably not coincidental. The Sumerians loved base 60 mathematics, and there are various ways to break this number down into significant astronomical or numerological components, which again suggests that we're dealing with something other than straightforward chronology. These numbers are too neat, too mathematically convenient. They're not the messy durations you'd expect from actual historical reigns. They're elegant, structured, purposeful, which means they were chosen for reasons we may not fully understand, embedded with meanings that the ancient scribes grasped immediately, but that we have to painstakingly reconstruct through mathematical analysis and comparative mythology and educated guessing. And sometimes, all that scholarly apparatus still leaves us uncertain, still wondering whether we've captured the intended meaning or just invented a plausible story that sounds good in academic journals but completely misses whatever the Sumerians were actually trying to say, and that uncertainty is uncomfortable. It violates our desire for mastery over the past, for the illusion that with enough education and enough artifacts and enough clever interpretation, we can fully understand what ancient people were thinking. But maybe we can't. Maybe there are some things that are just lost, some context that can never be recovered, some meanings that died with the last person who understood them, and all we're left with is the text, the bare words, the numbers, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 200 years total, and we can analyze them and contextualize them and theorize about them, but we can never quite know what it felt like to be a Sumerian hearing these numbers recited, whether they seemed obvious or mysterious, literal or symbolic, whether everyone understood them the same way, or whether there was debate even then about what the Void-era chronology actually meant, and in the absence of that knowledge, we're basically telling ourselves stories about stories, interpretations of interpretations, building elaborate scholarly edifices on foundations that might be more fragile than we'd like to admit, which is a sobering thought but also kind of liberating, because if we can't know for certain, then we're free to keep investigating, keep questioning, keep proposing new interpretations without the burden of having to be definitively right. We can play with the possibilities, entertain multiple explanations simultaneously, hold contradictory ideas in tension without having to resolve them, which is actually much closer to how the ancient world probably worked anyway. They didn't have our obsession with consistency and logical coherence. They were comfortable with paradox and ambiguity, in ways we've trained ourselves not to be, which might be why their texts are so difficult for us, not because they're primitive, but because they're operating according to different rules of meaning-making, rules we've forgotten or never learned. Let's talk about the flood itself in more detail, because you really can't separate the question of the Void Era's duration from the event that supposedly ended it, and the Mesopotamian flood tradition is rich and complex, appearing in multiple texts from different periods, and while the biblical version in Genesis is more familiar to most people, the Sumerian original is older and in some ways more detailed, particularly in texts like the Atrahasis epic and the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood survivor, whether you call him Utnapishtim or Atrahasis or Ziusudra depending on which version you're reading, tells his story of divine warning and ark construction and survival while the rest of humanity perishes, and the flood serves multiple functions in Mesopotamian literature. It's simultaneously a historical memory, possibly of actual catastrophic flooding in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, a theological statement about divine power and human limits, and a chronological marker, separating the mythical past from the historical present, and that last function is what concerns us here, because the flood creates a boundary, it ends the Void Era and begins something new, something more recognizably human, and after the flood, according to the king list, kingship descends from heaven again, this time to Kish, and the post-Diluvian kings rule for much shorter periods, we're talking decades or at most a few centuries rather than tens of thousands of years, which suggests that something fundamental changed, either in the nature of kingship or in the way it was recorded or in reality itself if you want to take the mythological framework seriously, and scholars have spilled considerable ink trying to figure out what this transition represents, whether it marks the beginning of actual historical memory, the point where the Sumerians started keeping reliable records, or whether it's a theological statement about human decline, the idea that people after the flood are diminished versions of their antediluvian ancestors, shorter-lived, less wise, more prone to error and sin, which is a common theme in ancient Near Eastern thought. This sense of decay from an original perfection, time as a process of degradation rather than progress, which is almost the opposite of how we think about history today. We imagine ourselves improving, advancing, building towards some better future, while the Sumerians looked backward to a lost golden age. the Void Era when kings ruled forever, and the gods walked among humans and everything was somehow more than it is now, and you can see this same pattern in other ancient traditions. The Greek ages of man declining from gold to silver to bronze to iron, Hesiod complaining that he lives in the worst age, the Hindu concept of yugas, enormous cosmic cycles where each age is darker and more corrupt than the one before, and these aren't just pessimistic people grumbling about how things used to be better. These are sophisticated philosophical frameworks for understanding historical change, and they might have something to teach us even if we don't accept their premises, because our own faith in progress looks increasingly questionable the more we actually examine what we've gained and lost in our technological advancement. And maybe the ancients, looking at their enormous cities and complex bureaucracies and realizing that despite all this sophistication, they still couldn't prevent warfare and famine and general human misery. Maybe they had a point when they imagined that something had been lost, that the very architecture of reality had changed, that the Void Era represented a different mode of existence that was no longer accessible after the flood. And whether you interpret that literally or metaphorically, it's a powerful idea, the notion that there are thresholds in time, moments when everything changes and can never change back. And the flood is the ultimate threshold, the original apocalypse, the end of the world as it was known, and what comes after is necessarily different, lesser, more fragile, and the enormous chronology of the Void Era serves to emphasize that difference, to make the contrast stark, to say, look how much was lost, look how far we've fallen. And maybe that's the answer to our question about duration. Maybe the Void Era lasted exactly as long as it needed to in order to make that point, in order to create a before so different from the after that no one could miss the significance of the transition. Now, here's where we need to address another scholarly debate, one that's been simmering in academic circles since the 19th century when cuneiform was first deciphered, and this debate concerns the relationship between Mesopotamian and biblical flood narratives, because as soon as scholars could read the Sumerian and Babylonian texts, they realized that the Genesis flood story was almost certainly derived from, or at least influenced by, these earlier Mesopotamian versions. The parallels are too specific to be coincidental. You have the same basic plot, the same divine warning, the same construction of an ark, the same animals saved, the same raven and dove sent out to find dry land, the same sacrifice after the waters recede, and this discovery was shocking in the 19th century. It challenged traditional understandings of biblical authority and uniqueness, and the debate about what this borrowing means and how it happened and what it tells us about the development of ancient Near Eastern literature continues to this day, but for our purposes, what's interesting is how the chronology differs, because the biblical text compresses everything dramatically. Noah lives for 950 years, which sounds impressive until you compare it to Elulim's 28,800, and the entire period from Adam to the flood is only about 1,056 years in the standard biblical chronology, which is nothing compared to the 241,200 years of the Void Era, and this compression raises interesting questions about how and why the numbers changed as the story moved from Sumerian to Hebrew contexts. Were the biblical authors deliberately scaling things down to make them more believable, or did they simply have different chronological frameworks, different understandings of how to encode time in narrative? Or were they working from versions of the Mesopotamian tradition that had already undergone modification, layers of editing and reinterpretation that transformed the vast Sumerian timescape into something more compact and manageable? And scholars have proposed all these explanations and more. There's no consensus, which is par for the course in biblical studies where every statement generates immediate controversy and three competing theories. But the important point is that the flood tradition traveled. It moved across cultures and languages and centuries, and each time it moved, it changed, adapted to new contexts, took on new meanings, and the chronology, the specific numbers assigned to the antediluvian period, was one of the things that shifted in this transmission, which tells us that ancient scribes and editors felt free to modify these numbers. They didn't treat them as sacrosanct or untouchable. which suggests that maybe we shouldn't either. Maybe we should follow their lead and recognize that these chronologies are flexible, multivalent, open to reinterpretation depending on what work they need to do in a given cultural moment. And if that's the case, then asking how long the Void Era really lasted is missing the point, because there might not be a really, there might only be different versions, different traditions, different ways of mapping the unmappable space before history began. Here's a joke, and I'm warning you in advance that it's probably too clever for its own good. A Babylonian scribe walks into a bar. Well, actually, he walks into a beer house because bars haven't been invented yet, and he says to the beer seller, "I'd like something that will help me remember a 28,800-year reign." And the beer seller says, "I have just the thing. It's called writing. You press meanings into clay and they last forever." And the scribe says, "I know, I literally invented that. I'm just trying to drink away the existential anxiety of being the bridge between oral and written culture." And the beer seller says, "That'll be 2 shekels of barley," which isn't really a punchline but accurately reflects the economic realities of early Mesopotamian tavern culture, where beer was often paid for in grain, and also captures something of the genuine weight that must have fallen on the first scribes, the people who took the fluid oral traditions of their culture and froze them in clay, making decisions about what to include and how to phrase it and which numbers to use, decisions that would echo across millennia and shape how we understand the ancient world. And you wonder if they felt that responsibility, if they knew they were creating artifacts that would outlive their civilization by thousands of years, or if they were just doing their jobs, copying what needed to be copied, recording what needed to be recorded, maybe occasionally making stuff up when they got bored or thought they could improve on the source material. And honestly, both things are probably true. They were simultaneously reverent preservers of tradition and creative adapters, making it up as they went along, which describes most human cultural transmission. We're always both faithful to what came before and inventing something new, and the line between preservation and innovation is much blurrier than we like to pretend. And the Sumerian scribes who gave us the Void Era chronology were no different. They were working within traditions they'd inherited, but also shaping those traditions through their choices. And we're the inheritors of those choices. We're reading the version that survived. But there were probably other versions, other numbers, other ways of structuring the antediluvian period that didn't make it, that were lost in fires or floods or simply in the natural winnowing of time that destroys most things and preserves only a tiny fraction. And so the Void Era chronology we have is contingent. It could have been different. It exists in the form it does partly through accident, partly through the choices of ancient scribes, partly through the preferences of later copyists. And recognizing that contingency is important because it prevents us from treating the text as some kind of transparent window onto ancient reality. It reminds us that we're always dealing with mediated information, filtered through human decisions and limited by what happened to survive, and humility about those limitations is the beginning of wisdom, or at least the beginning of honest scholarship, which might be the same thing or might be totally different. I honestly can't tell at this point. It's very late. Everything is starting to blur together, which is perfect for a bedtime history video. You should be getting drowsy by now. Your thoughts should be loosening, becoming less rigorous, drifting towards sleep. And if you're still wide awake, well, we've got 3 more sections to go, so settle in. We're not done with the Void Era yet. Not by a long shot. There's still so much to say about these impossible chronologies and what they tell us or don't tell us about the ancient world and about ourselves and about time itself, which turns out to be much stranger and more slippery than we usually acknowledge, much harder to pin down or measure or make sense of, especially when you're dealing with texts that treat it as something malleable, something that can be stretched or compressed depending on narrative needs, which is actually how time works in human experience, isn't it? Some moments last forever, some years disappear in an instant. Clock time and experience time are completely different things, And maybe the Sumerians understood that better than we do. Maybe their willingness to assign 28,800-year reigns wasn't ignorance, but rather a sophisticated understanding of how time operates in myth and memory, how the deep past has a different temporal quality than the recent past, how things that happened before exist in a kind of eternal present that doesn't follow normal chronological rules. And if you've ever listened to an old person tell stories about their childhood, you know what I mean, the way those stories have a timeless quality, the way they seem to describe a world that's both specific and universal, both particular and archetypal, and the Void Era might be operating in that same register. It's the childhood of humanity as imagined by the Sumerians, the time before things got complicated, before history became a burden, before the weight of accumulated years started bearing down on every present moment. And childhood lasts as long as it needs to last. It's not measured in years, but in the intensity of experience and the depth of formation. And maybe that's what the 241,200 years of the Void Era represent, not actual chronological duration, but rather developmental time, the space needed for civilization to take shape, for kingship to be established, for the fundamental patterns of human society to crystallize. And once that formation was complete, once the mold was set, then the flood could come and everything could begin again, but this time in historical time, measurable time, time that proceeds at a human pace rather than a cosmic one, and that transition from one kind of time to another is what the flood marks. It's not just water washing away the old world, it's a shift in the very fabric of temporal experience, and the fact that we struggle to understand this, that we keep asking, but how long did it really last, shows how thoroughly we've internalized our own temporal regime, how difficult it is for us to imagine other ways of relating to time, other frameworks for organizing the past. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Void Era, not some specific answer about duration, but rather the recognition that our questions might be inappropriate, that we're trying to extract modern answers from ancient texts that were never designed to provide them, and the frustration we feel is productive. It should push us to question our assumptions, to wonder whether time itself is as straightforward as we've been taught, whether chronology is really the best way to organize historical knowledge or just the way we've chosen to do it, naturalized through repetition until it seems like the only option, when in fact it's just one option among many. And the Sumerians, bless them, chose differently, and their choice has survived long enough to trouble ours, which is a remarkable achievement really, to create a chronology so strange that it's still generating confusion and debate and bedtime history videos 4,000 years later. That's influence, that's cultural longevity, that's winning the ultimate game of leaving your mark on the world, even if the mark you left is a giant question mark, a puzzle that can't quite be solved, a void that resists all our attempts to fill it with certain knowledge. The astronomical interpretation of the Void Era chronology deserves more attention than we've given it so far, because if the antediluvian rain lengths are encoding celestial cycles, then we're dealing with a very different kind of document than a straightforward king list. We're looking at a text that's simultaneously historical chronicle, mythological narrative, and astronomical treatise, which would make it a remarkable example of ancient intellectual synthesis, the kind of thing that only works if you don't separate knowledge into neat disciplinary categories the way we do, and the Sumerians didn't. For them, astronomy and theology and history and mathematics all flowed together. They were all different aspects of the same cosmic order, all reflections of divine patterns that manifested at different scales. And if you wanted to understand kingship, you had to understand the movement of celestial bodies, because earthly rule was meant to mirror heavenly order, and the numbers that described planetary cycles could therefore also describe royal reigns, not because kings literally ruled for 28,800 years, but because that number contained meaning on multiple levels simultaneously. It pointed to astronomical phenomena, while also establishing royal legitimacy, while also encoding mythological truths, and this kind of multivalent meaning is hard for modern minds to grasp, because we're trained to think that words and numbers should mean one thing clearly. Ambiguity is treated as a flaw rather than a feature, but for the ancient Mesopotamians, ambiguity was productive. It allowed a single text to do multiple jobs at once, to speak to different audiences in different ways. The astronomer priests would read the celestial meanings. The royal court would appreciate the legitimation narratives. The common people might take it as straightforward history or understood mythology, and all these readings were valid simultaneously. There was no true meaning that excluded the others, which is a radically different epistemology than what we're used to, and it makes interpretation difficult because we keep trying to choose between these meanings, to decide whether the Void Era chronology is astronomical or historical or mythological, when the answer might be yes, all of those, simultaneously, and if that's the case, then the question of duration becomes even more complex, because we'd need to ask, duration in which framework? Astronomical time or mythological time or historical time or some other temporal dimension entirely, and the text might not distinguish between these, might deliberately blur them together, creating a chronology that operates on multiple planes at once, which sounds mystical but might just be sophisticated, a way of embedding maximum information in minimum space, of making every number count in multiple ways, which is exactly what you'd want if clay tablets were expensive and writing was labor-intensive and you needed to preserve important knowledge across generations using limited resources. You develop techniques for compression, for layering meaning, for making text do multiple jobs, and maybe that's what we're seeing in the Void Era chronology, a masterclass in informational density. And our confusion comes from trying to unpack meanings that were meant to stay packed, to separate layers that were meant to remain fused, and the more we pull apart, the more we lose, until we're left with numbers that don't quite make sense in any single framework, but that probably made perfect sense in the original context where all frameworks were present simultaneously. The scholarly literature on Mesopotamian chronology is vast and contentious, with different schools of thought emerging from different national and theoretical traditions, and you have the German philological tradition emphasizing rigorous textual analysis, the American anthropological tradition looking for cultural patterns and meaning systems, the British archaeological tradition focusing on material evidence and stratigraphy, and more recently, various post-colonial and postmodern approaches questioning the entire enterprise of trying to reconstruct ancient chronologies using Western academic frameworks, and these different approaches generate different answers to our question about the Void Era's duration, or rather, they generate different questions that replace our original question because the German philologists might focus on variant readings across different manuscripts, trying to establish the most authentic version of the king list, while the anthropologists might be more interested in what the chronology reveals about Sumerian conceptual structures, how they categorize time and organize their understanding of the past, and the archaeologists might be trying to correlate the king list with actual material evidence, looking for stratigraphic layers or datable artifacts that might correspond to the cities and kings mentioned, and the postmodern scholars might be arguing that the whole project of establishing a definitive chronology is misguided, that we should instead focus on how these texts were used, what work they did in Sumerian society, how they were mobilized to support various power structures, and all these approaches have merit, all generate insights, and all are ultimately limited by the nature of the evidence and the distance between us and the ancient world we're trying to understand, and sometimes I think we should just admit that we're making educated guesses dressed up in academic language, that our certainty is performed rather than real, that the footnotes and citations and theoretical frameworks are scaffolding we build to support interpretations that remain fundamentally speculative, which doesn't mean they're worthless. Speculation is valuable. It's how we explore possibility space, how we push beyond what's immediately obvious or easily provable, but it does mean we should hold our conclusions lightly, with appropriate humility, acknowledging that tomorrow someone might find a new tablet or develop a new methodology, or propose a new interpretation that completely overturns what we thought we knew, and that's exciting. That's the joy of historical inquiry, the sense that we're always on the edge of discovery, always potentially one artifact away from a revolution in understanding, though more often we're just gradually accumulating incremental insights that slowly shift the consensus without anyone quite noticing until they look back and realize the field has moved, which is a less dramatic but probably more accurate picture of how knowledge advances, not through sudden breakthroughs but through patient accumulation of evidence and argument, Through thousands of small choices by thousands of scholars over decades and centuries, each one adjusting the picture slightly, and what we end up with is something like the Wikipedia model of truth, where no single contribution is definitive but the aggregate over time converges towards something useful even if it never reaches perfect accuracy. And maybe that's okay, maybe that's the best we can do with ancient history, approximate the past without ever quite capturing it, get close enough to see its outlines while accepting that the details will always remain fuzzy, and if that seems unsatisfying, well, satisfaction isn't guaranteed in this line of work. Frustration is much more common, the gnawing sense that the answers are right there in the tablets if we could just read them correctly, if we could just crack the code, if we could just think like Sumerians for 5 minutes instead of thinking like modern academics who happen to be studying Sumerians, but we can't. We're stuck in our own heads, our own cultural contexts, our own historical moment, and all we can do is make the attempt. Keep trying to bridge the gap, knowing we'll never quite succeed, but hoping that the effort itself is worthwhile. That the attempt to understand the past, even when full understanding is impossible, still teaches us something about ourselves and our relationship to time and history and human meaning-making across the millennia. Here's another joke, though calling it a joke might be generous. Why did the antediluvian king cross the Euphrates? And the answer is trick question, he didn't. Because antediluvian kings ruled for so long they never needed to go anywhere. They just sat on their thrones for 28,000 years, letting the world come to them, which actually raises interesting questions about mobility and administration in these impossibly long reigns. Did Alulim ever leave Eridu during his 28,800 years? Did he travel to other cities, form diplomatic relations, wage wars? Or did he just sit there like a cosmic Buddha, unchanging and eternal, while generations of subjects were born and lived and died in his presence? And if the latter, what does that tell us about the nature of antediluvian kingship? Was it more like a natural force than a political office, less about active governance and more about simply being, occupying the throne as a kind of cosmic anchor point around which society could organize itself? And this interpretation actually fits with some strands of ancient Near Eastern royal ideology, where the king's primary job wasn't to do things, but to be the right person in the right place, maintaining cosmic order through his very existence, through his performance of ritual duties and his embodiment of divine favor and action, in the sense of military campaigns or administrative reforms, was secondary to this fundamental ontological role. And if that's how we should understand antediluvian kingship, then the enormous reign lengths make more sense. They're not describing biographical time, the span of a human life. They're describing something more like geological time, the duration of a cosmic age, a period when reality was ordered in a particular way, and the king is less an individual person and more a personification of that ordering principle, which is getting pretty abstract, I realize. We've moved far from the concrete question of how many years the void era lasted, but maybe that movement is necessary. Maybe we have to get abstract to get anywhere with this material, because the concrete approaches haven't worked. We've tried treating the numbers literally, and that produces absurdities. We've tried reducing them mathematically, and that feels arbitrary. We've tried dismissing them as pure fiction, and that seems to miss something important about how seriously the Sumerians took their own texts. So maybe we need a different approach altogether. Maybe we need to think about what these numbers are doing rather than what they're saying, and what they're doing is creating a temporal structure that separates the primordial past from the historical present, establishing a before time when everything was different, when the rules that govern our world didn't apply or applied differently, and the specific numbers, 28,800 or 36,000 or 204,200, are less important than their sheer magnitude, their ability to invoke incomprehensibility, to gesture toward a depth of time that the human mind can't quite grasp. And maybe that incomprehensibility is the point. Maybe the void era is supposed to be beyond understanding, a mystery that frames all subsequent history. a darkness against which the light of recorded civilization can shine, and if we accept that, if we stop trying to solve the chronology and instead try to appreciate what it accomplishes effectively and structurally, then we might get closer to understanding what the Sumerians were actually doing with these texts, which wasn't writing history in any modern sense but rather creating founding myths, origin stories that did complex cultural work, and the chronology was part of that work, one element in a larger project of establishing Sumerian civilization as ancient, divinely sanctioned, connected to cosmic rather than merely human timescales. And whether we find that convincing or ridiculous or some mixture of both probably depends on our own relationship to authority and tradition and the stories we tell ourselves about where we come from, because we do the same thing. We create origin narratives that legitimate our present arrangements. We just do it differently, with evolution and social contract theory and Enlightenment philosophy, instead of with 28,800-year reigns. But the underlying impulse is similar, the need to ground ourselves in a story that explains how we got here and why things are the way they are. And the Sumerian story started in the Void era, with kingship descending from heaven and rulers reigning for impossible spans before the flood came and reset everything, and that story worked for them. It provided meaning and structure and continuity across generations, and the fact that it doesn't work for us, that we can't accept its chronology or its metaphysics, doesn't make it any less valuable as a window into how different human cultures organize their understanding of time and history and meaning, which is ultimately what we're after here, not some definitive answer about how many years the Void era lasted, but rather insight into how the Sumerians thought about time, what temporal categories they used, how they structured the relationship between past and present, and if we can get even a little bit of that, if we can momentarily see time through their eyes instead of our own, then all this confusion and complexity and scholarly debate will have been worth it. Because understanding other ways of being human, other ways of organizing experience and meaning, is valuable in itself. It expands our sense of what's possible, reminds us that our way isn't the only way, that the categories we take for granted are contingent and constructed and could be otherwise, and there's a kind of liberation in that recognition, a loosening of the grip that our own cultural assumptions have on us. And if bedtime history about Sumerian chronology can facilitate that loosening, if it can create a space where normal certainties dissolve and other possibilities become briefly visible before sleep takes over and everything gets even more surreal, well, that's about as much as we can hope for from any intellectual project, making the familiar strange and the strange familiar, and somewhere in that oscillation finding moments of genuine insight or at least interesting confusion, which might be the same thing, or close enough that the difference doesn't matter, especially at this hour. Especially when you're halfway between waking and sleeping, between the modern world and the ancient one, between certainty and doubt, between the measurable time of clocks and calendars and the deep time of myth and memory, where the Void era still exists, still exerts its influence, still shapes how we think about beginnings, even though we can't say exactly when it began or ended, or how long it lasted, or whether it happened at all. The tablets themselves, the physical objects that transmit the Void era chronology to us across 40 centuries, deserve our attention and respect, because these are remarkable artifacts, not just for what they say but for what they are, lumps of clay transformed through human ingenuity into information storage devices that outlast empires and religions and entire civilizations. And when you think about it, really think about it, there's something miraculous about the fact that we can read these tablets at all, that the marks pressed into clay by Sumerian scribes remain legible after thousands of years, that the information encoded in these fragile objects survived floods and fires and the general entropy of time, survived the collapse of Sumerian civilization itself, survived being buried in dirt for millennia, survived the archaeological excavations that brought them back to light, survived being cleaned and catalogued and studied and transported to museums around the world. And now, here we are, talking about them in a bedtime history video, their contents available to anyone with an internet connection, which would absolutely blow the mind of the scribe who created them, the idea that his work would be accessible to the entire world instantly. that his careful pressing of stylus into clay would result in some disembodied voice discussing antediluvian chronology, while people fall asleep in languages he never heard of in countries he never knew existed. And there's something beautiful about that continuity, about the fact that human communication can transcend its original context so completely, can be recontextualized and reinterpreted and repurposed thousands of years later, and the information persists. Even though everything else about the original situation has changed, the scribes are dead, the cities are ruined, the civilization is gone, the languages are extinct, but the numbers remain. 8,800 years, 36,000 years, 241 200 years total, 100. Etched in clay, waiting to confuse and fascinate whoever comes along with the skills to decode them. And that's the power of writing. It's a time machine, it's immortality, it's the closest thing we have to magic, the ability to preserve thoughts outside our heads, to send messages to the future, to participate in conversations with people we'll never meet. And the Sumerians figured this out 5,000 years ago when they started making marks on clay tablets to track grain deliveries, and they couldn't have known where it would lead, couldn't have imagined the technology we've built on top of that initial innovation, the printing presses and typewriters and computers and smartphones. But it all starts there, in ancient Mesopotamia, with some bureaucrat realizing that if you press a reed stylus into clay in particular patterns, you can record information, you can remember things without having to remember them, you can delegate memory to the physical world, and that delegation transforms everything. It makes possible all of civilization as we know it, because without writing there's no cumulative knowledge, no building on previous discoveries, no long-distance communication, no complex administration, no history in any recognizable sense. Just oral tradition and whatever people can hold in their heads, which is impressive but limited, and writing breaks those limits, exponentially expands what humans can do and know and build. And the fact that the first thing the Sumerians wrote down was probably grain receipts, and the last thing we might write down before our civilization collapses might be memes and tweets, says something about human priorities, but doesn't diminish the revolutionary nature of the technology itself. Writing is powerful, writing changes everything, and the clay tablets that preserve the Void-era chronology are exemplars of that power. They're proof that information can outlast its creators, that knowledge can transcend its generation, that we can learn from and argue with and be confused by people who've been dead for 4,000 years, which is either incredibly comforting or incredibly unsettling depending on your mood and your feelings about mortality and legacy and whether you want your words to survive after you're gone. And I suspect most people have mixed feelings about that. We want to be remembered, but we're not sure we want to be remembered forever. We want to communicate, but we're aware that communication across vast time periods is fraught with misunderstanding and reinterpretation. We write down what we mean, but future readers will impose their own meanings, will read us through lenses we can't anticipate, will find significance in things we thought were trivial, and miss the points we thought were obvious, which is exactly what we're doing with the Sumerian king list, reading it in ways its creators never intended, asking questions they wouldn't understand, imposing our chronological frameworks and empirical standards on a text that was created for completely different purposes, and yet the text allows this, accommodates our interpretation, while also resisting it, remains stubbornly itself even as we try to make it speak our language, answer our questions, resolve our doubts, and that resistance is valuable. It reminds us that the past isn't just raw material for present concerns, it has its own integrity, its own logic, its own way of being that we should respect even when we can't fully understand it. The archaeological context of the tablets adds another layer to our understanding because these objects weren't created in a vacuum, they were produced in specific places at specific times for specific purposes, and where they were found and what they were found with tells us something about how they were used, what role they played in ancient society, and many of the king list tablets come from temple or palace contexts, which makes sense. These are official documents, records maintained by institutional authorities, and that institutional emotional setting shapes their content. Because the people creating these lists had agendas, they were writing for patrons, serving political or religious purposes, and the chronologies they recorded reflected and reinforced particular power structures, particular understandings of legitimacy and authority, and we have to read with that in mind, understanding that these aren't neutral historical records. There's no such thing as a neutral historical record. All history is written by someone with a perspective, serving interests, making choices about what to include and what to omit and how to frame things, and the Sumerian scribes were no different. They were embedded in networks of power and patronage. Their king lists legitimated current rulers by connecting them to ancient lineages, and the Void-era chronology, with its impossible reign lengths, served that legitimation function by making kingship itself seem primordial, eternal, divinely sanctioned from the very beginning. And if you're trying to maintain royal authority in a complex urban society with competing factions and potential threats, that kind of ideological support is valuable. It naturalizes hierarchy, makes the current arrangement seem inevitable and unchangeable, rooted in cosmic order rather than contingent historical circumstances. And this is what ideology does. It takes what's actually constructed and makes it seem natural, takes what's actually recent and makes it seem ancient, takes what's actually contentious and makes it seem obvious. And the Void-era chronology is a masterpiece of ideological work. It reaches back before history into myth and claims kingship was there from the start, before the flood, before time began in any normal sense, which means you can't challenge it without challenging reality itself. And that's a pretty effective rhetorical strategy. You have to give them credit. The Sumerians understood power and how to maintain it through narrative control, through the careful management of collective memory, through the creation of authoritative texts that define what everyone should believe about the past. And we do the same thing today. We just use different technologies and different narratives, national origin stories and constitutional mythology and founding fathers and all the stories we tell ourselves about where we came from and why we're special, and those stories are just as much ideological constructions as the Void-era chronology, just as designed to serve present purposes under the guise of historical truth, which doesn't make them false exactly, but does mean we should read them critically, understanding that history is always in dialogue with the present, always being used for something, and the past is always being reconstructed to serve current needs, which is both inevitable and slightly tragic. Inevitable because we can't escape our own perspective. We can't see the past except through present eyes, but tragic because it means the past itself, the actual lived experience of ancient people, is forever inaccessible. We only get versions, interpretations, reconstructions shaped by chains of transmission and the limitations of evidence and the biases of historians, and somewhere in that gap between the actual past and our reconstructions of it is where the Void era lives, neither fully historical nor fully mythological, neither completely real nor completely imaginary, but rather something in between, something that resists our categories while still exerting influence on how we understand ancient Mesopotamia and human civilization and the very nature of time itself. Here's another quirky interpretation that exists on the fringes of academia, proposed by certain comparative mythologists who argue that the Void-era chronology and similar chronologies from other ancient cultures, the Hindu yugas or the Mayan long count, represent actual memories of cataclysmic events in human prehistory, possibly the end of the Ice Age or other major geological or climatic disruptions that ancient peoples experienced and encoded in mythological frameworks involving enormous time spans and world-destroying floods. And this interpretation has the advantage of taking the texts seriously, treating them as preserving real information rather than dismissing them as pure fantasy. But it requires some creative reimagining of what memory means across such vast timescales, because if the flood myth preserves memory of Ice Age glacial melting, we're talking about events from 10 to 15,000 years ago, long before writing, long before Sumerian civilization. And the idea that accurate information could be transmitted orally across that many generations seems implausible, though not impossible. Oral traditions can be remarkably stable, especially when embedded in ritual practice and institutional authority, and there are documented cases of indigenous Australian oral traditions preserving accurate geographical information about landscapes that were submerged by rising sea levels thousands of years ago. So maybe it's not completely crazy to suggest that the Mesopotamian flood myth preserves some distorted memory of actual catastrophic flooding, and if that's the case, then the Void Era represents the prehistoric period before that flooding, the time before the climate stabilized and agriculture became possible and civilization emerged, and the impossible chronology reflects the difficulty of conceptualizing that prehistoric time, of understanding how long humans had been around before writing and cities and all the things that seem to define civilization, and from the perspective of a Bronze Age scribe trying to make sense of the deep past. Giving the antediluvian period enormous chronological depth might have been a reasonable way to acknowledge its antiquity, while also distinguishing it from historical time, setting it apart as different, other, not subject to the same rules. And there's something appealing about this interpretation. The idea that mythology isn't just making things up, but rather processing real experiences through symbolic frameworks, trying to understand and preserve and transmit knowledge about events that exceeded normal comprehension, and the specific numbers might be wrong but the gesture is right. The attempt to grapple with human deep time, with the vast stretches of prehistory that predate our written records, and maybe that's what the Void Era is really about, not specific chronology, but rather the acknowledgement of depth, the recognition that history extends far beyond what can be definitively documented, that there are layers of human experience beneath the foundation of civilization, and those layers matter even if we can't access them directly, even if all we have are mythological fragments and impossible numbers and tablets that raise more questions than they answer, because those fragments and numbers and tablets are all we have. They're the traces that survived, the signals that made it through the noise, and we should attend to them carefully, respectfully, with appropriate humility about the limits of our understanding, because they're connecting us to something old and important, something about human meaning-making and historical consciousness and the drive to understand where we came from, which seems to be a universal human impulse. Every culture has origin stories, every tradition looks back towards some primordial beginning, and the variations are fascinating, the way different peoples imagine that beginning differently. But underneath the variations is the same basic need, the need to situate ourselves in time, to have a story about how we got from then to now, from the void to the present moment, and the Sumerians told their version of that story, and it involved kings who ruled for 28,000 years and a flood that reset everything, and we tell our versions, and they involve evolution and the Big Bang and progress towards some imagined better future, and neither version is complete or final or perfectly accurate. They're both stories, both attempts to make sense of existence in time, and the fact that they're different doesn't make one right and one wrong. It makes them both interesting, both worth studying, both illuminating different aspects of the human relationship to temporality and history and meaning. And if we can hold that plurality, if we can appreciate multiple ways of thinking about time without needing to collapse them into a single authoritative account, then we'll be doing something the ancients would probably approve of, because they were comfortable with multiple stories, multiple versions, multiple truths coexisting in productive tension, and it's only modern empiricism that demands singular correct answers, and maybe that demand is too restrictive. Maybe it closes off possibilities that would enrich our understanding, and maybe the Void Era, with its impossible chronology and its resistance to our explanatory frameworks, is teaching us that lesson, is showing us that some questions don't have answers, some mysteries don't get solved, some texts keep their secrets, and that's okay. That's good even, because mystery is valuable. Uncertainty is productive. Not knowing creates space for imagination and interpretation and continued engagement, and if we knew exactly how long the Void Era lasted, if we could definitively settle the question, well, that would be the end of the conversation. We'd move on to other topics, but because we can't settle it, because every answer generates new questions and every interpretation has problems, we keep coming back, keep thinking about it, keep trying to figure it out. and in that ongoing engagement with an ancient text that refuses to yield its secrets, we're participating in something larger than just academic history. We're participating in the human conversation with the past, the dialogue across time that defines us as historical beings, as creatures who live not just in the present but in relation to what came before. And the Void Era is part of that conversation. It's the Sumerians speaking to us across 40 centuries, and we're speaking back, and neither of us fully understands the other, but we're trying. We're engaged in the effort, and that effort matters. That's what makes us human in the fullest sense. Not just the ability to remember, but the drive to understand, to make sense, to weave past and present into coherent narratives even when the materials resist. Coherence. Even when the tablets are fragmentary and the chronology is impossible and the whole thing seems designed to frustrate anyone looking for simple answers, because simple answers are overrated, complexity is where the real insight lives, in the gaps and contradictions and uncertainties that force us to think harder, question deeper, imagine more broadly. And if bedtime history about the Void Era accomplishes nothing else, at least it's keeping alive that spirit of engaged questioning, that willingness to sit with confusion, that patience with texts and times that won't easily give up their meanings. And those are good qualities to cultivate, in history as in life, because not everything needs to be resolved, not everything needs to be clear. Sometimes it's enough to be present with the mystery, to acknowledge the limits of knowledge while still pursuing it, to accept that we're all just making educated guesses about the past while pretending to more certainty than we actually possess. And the Sumerians were doing the same thing, making educated guesses about their own past, projecting backwards from their present moment, creating a chronology that served their needs while perhaps only loosely corresponding to any actual historical reality. And we're doing the same thing with them, projecting our categories onto their texts, creating interpretations that serve our needs while perhaps only loosely corresponding to what they actually meant. And this chain of projection and interpretation and misunderstanding might seem depressing, might seem to suggest that historical knowledge is impossible, but actually it's liberating, because it means history isn't dead, isn't fixed, isn't settled, it's alive, it's contested, it's open to reinterpretation as our needs and questions and frameworks evolve. And the Void Era can mean different things in different eras, can answer different questions for different audiences, can be simultaneously astronomical data and mythological narrative and theological statement and ideological legitimation and historical record and complete fiction, depending on who's reading and why and what they need from the text. And all those meanings are valid because meaning isn't inherent in texts. It's created in the interaction between text and reader, in the dialogue between past and present, and that dialogue never ends. It just keeps developing, keeps generating new insights and new confusions, and somewhere in that ongoing conversation is where truth lives, not as a fixed thing but as an emergent property of engaged interpretation, which is a very postmodern thing to say but also kind of obvious once you think about it, because how else would truth work in history? How else could we have knowledge of the past except through interpretation? And if interpretation is always perspectival, always situated, always partial, then truth must be too, which doesn't mean anything goes, doesn't mean all interpretations are equally valid, but does mean we should be humble about our claims, cautious about our certainties, open to revision when new evidence or new frameworks suggest different understandings. And the Void Era is a perfect case study in all this because it's so spectacularly resistant to any single interpretation, so obviously weird and problematic and multi-layered, that it forces interpretive humility. You can't look at a text claiming 28,800-year reigns and think, I've got this figured out. Anyone who claims to have definitively solved the Void Era chronology is either lying or deluded. The most you can say is, here's one way to think about it, or this interpretation seems productive, or these are the problems with the other approaches. But you can't say this is what it means, because it means too much, means too many things, resists reduction to any single explanatory framework, and that resistance is the gift it gives us, the invitation to think more complexly about time and history and meaning, to question our assumptions about chronology and documentation and what counts as historical knowledge. And if we accept that invitation, if we let the Void Era trouble our certainties rather than trying to domesticate it through forced interpretations, then we might learn something genuinely valuable, might expand our sense of what's possible in historical understanding, might become better readers of ancient texts and better thinkers about time, which would make all this confusion worthwhile, all these thousands of words about impossible chronologies and clay tablets and Sumerian scribes and scholarly debates that never quite resolve anything. It would all be worth it if it helped us think more carefully about how we know what we claim to know about the past, and whether our knowing is ever as secure as we pretend, and whether mystery might be more productive than certainty, and whether the Void Era, precisely because we can't determine how long it lasted, might be teaching us something important about the nature of historical knowledge itself, about its limits and possibilities, and the strange recursive quality of trying to understand people who were themselves trying to understand people who came before them, stretching back through chains of memory and transmission until you reach something like the Void Era, a boundary condition, a place where historical knowledge meets mythology and mathematics and theology and all the other ways humans have tried to make sense of time and origins, and the distance between now and then, between the known present and the unknowable beginning, between the light of documentation and the darkness of the void, which might last 200 years, or might last no time at all, because it never existed, except as a useful fiction. And honestly, at this point, I'm not sure it matters. The distinction between existed and didn't exist gets blurry when you're talking about ancient texts and mythological frameworks and times before memory, and maybe that blurriness is appropriate. Maybe sharp distinctions are the wrong tool for this job. Maybe we need softer categories, more flexible thinking, a willingness to entertain contradictions and hold multiple possibilities simultaneously. And if that sounds like I'm giving up on answering the question, well, maybe I am. Maybe the question doesn't have an answer, or has too many answers, or the answer is the question itself, the ongoing engagement with texts that won't quite make sense. And if you're still listening, if you haven't drifted off to sleep yet, then you're participating in that engagement, you're part of the conversation, you're helping keep alive the memory of the Void Era and the questions it raises, and that's something that's meaningful, even if we can't say exactly how meaningful or exactly what it means, because meaning, like time, like the Void Era itself, is slippery and contested and ultimately mysterious, resistant to final determination, and maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some things should remain mysteries, should keep their secrets, should continue generating questions across the millennia, connecting us to the deep past through our shared confusion, our common humanity in the face of time's depths. And on that note, let's move toward our final section, where we'll try to wrap up what's been an admittedly sprawling discussion, try to bring some closure even though closure might not be appropriate, try to say something definitive about a topic that's resisted definition for 4,000 years, and if that sounds impossible, well, you're probably right. But we'll try anyway, because that's what humans do. We keep trying to understand, keep pushing against the boundaries of knowledge, keep interrogating texts and artifacts and fragments from the past, hoping that eventually, if we work at it long enough, if we approach from enough angles, if we let enough perspectives accumulate, we'll glimpse something true about the Void Era and about ourselves and about time and history and meaning. And even if that glimpse is fleeting, even if certainty remains forever out of reach, the pursuit is worthwhile, the question is valuable, the engagement is meaningful, and as you drift towards sleep, as consciousness loosens its grip and thoughts become less linear, less rigorous, less concerned with academic precision and empirical verification, maybe that's when the Void Era makes the most sense, in that liminal space between waking and sleeping, between modern skepticism and ancient belief, between the measurable time of science and the mythological time of origins. And there, in that space, the question of how long it lasted becomes less important than the fact that it existed at all. This strange textual artifact from ancient Mesopotamia that still has the power to fascinate and confuse and provoke thought, still matters somehow, even though its numbers are absurd and its claims are impossible and its meanings are multi-layered and contradictory. And that persistence across time, That ability to remain relevant and interesting and worthy of discussion millennia after its creation is its own kind of answer, not to the question of duration, but to the deeper question of why we care about ancient history at all, why we devote time and energy and intellectual resources to understanding people who lived and died thousands of years ago. And the answer is that they're us, they're human. They faced similar questions about origins and meaning and time. They tried to make sense of existence in a confusing universe. They created texts and stories and chronologies that did cultural work, that helped them navigate their world. And we're doing the same thing, still grappling with the same fundamental questions, still trying to understand where we came from and where we're going and what it all means. And the Sumerians, with their impossible chronologies and their void era and their clay tablets that survived the collapse of their entire civilization, they're our companions in that struggle, our ancestors in the broadest sense. And when we read their texts, when we puzzle over their numbers, when we debate about how long the void era lasted, we're not just doing academic history, we're participating in a conversation that spans all of human civilization. We're adding our voices to a dialogue that's been ongoing for millennia and will continue long after we're gone. And there's something profound about that, something that transcends the specific question and touches something deeper about what it means to be human in time, to be conscious of the past and concerned about the future, to be creatures who tell stories about beginnings and endings, about voids and floods and impossible reigns. And if the void era teaches us anything, it's that those stories matter, not because they're accurate, or because we can fact-check them, or because they align with modern scientific understanding, but because they're how we make sense of ourselves, how we situate ourselves in the grand sweep of time, how we connect our brief lives to something larger and longer lasting. And the fact that we're still talking about the Void Era 4,000 years later suggests that the Sumerians succeeded. They created something that lasted, that mattered, that continues to provoke and puzzle and inspire, and that's about as much immortality as anyone can hope for. Which brings us to our conclusion, our attempt to sum up what's been a long and winding journey through ancient chronology and modern interpretation. And honestly, I'm not sure what to conclude except that the question remains open, the mystery persists, and maybe that's the real lesson, that some questions don't have answers, they have responses, ongoing engagement, continued conversation, and the Void Era is one of those questions, and we're part of the response, all of us who wonder about it, who think about it, who let it trouble our sleep. And in that wondering and thinking and troubling, we're keeping something alive, some connection to the ancient world, some appreciation for human diversity in thought and time, some humility about the limits of knowledge. And if this video has accomplished anything, I hope it's that. I hope it's made you think differently about time and history and ancient texts, or at least given you something interesting to fall asleep to, which was the original goal. And on that note, let's move to our final section, where I promise we'll bring this to some kind of conclusion. Though what that conclusion will be, I honestly don't know yet. We'll figure it out together as we go. As we approach the end of our journey through the Void Era, through the impossible chronologies and fragmentary tablets and scholarly debates that never quite resolve into satisfying answers, I find myself thinking about what it means to tell history for sleep, to take the academic discourse around ancient Mesopotamian chronology and transform it into something that's meant to quiet the mind, to ease the transition from waking to dreaming. And there's something paradoxical about that project, because history should wake us up, should shake us from complacency, should challenge our assumptions and force us to confront the strangeness of the past. But here we are using it as a lullaby, letting the details of Sumerian king lists and antediluvian reign lengths and textual variants wash over us like white noise, soothing rather than stimulating. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe there's something in the deep past that's genuinely restful, something about contemplating time on such vast scales that our immediate concerns shrink into insignificance. Our worries about tomorrow or next week or next year seem trivial when measured against 28,800-year reigns and 241,200-year chronologies and civilizations that rose and fell and left nothing but clay tablets and ruined cities. And from that perspective, the perspective of deep time, everything becomes lighter, less urgent, more dreamlike. Because what does it matter? Really, what does any of it matter when you're thinking in terms of millennia and cosmic cycles and the slow accumulation and erosion of human meaning across the ages? And that realization could be depressing, could lead to nihilism, but it could also be liberating, could free us from the tyranny of the immediate, could help us see our lives as part of a larger pattern that extends far beyond our individual experiences. And the void era, precisely because it's so strange and so contested and so impossible to pin down definitively, serves as a kind of meditation object, something to think about that resists easy comprehension, that keeps the mind occupied without demanding too much, that allows for a gentle disengagement from the pressing concerns of daily life. And as you lie there in the dark, listening to this voice talk about ancient chronologies and clay tablets, you're participating in a ritual that's probably quite old, the ritual of storytelling before sleep, except instead of fairy tales or family legends, you're hearing about scholarly debates concerning the interpretation of cuneiform texts. And there's something absurd about that, something funny, but also something appropriate. Because what are academic debates if not a form of storytelling? What is history if not an elaborate narrative we construct from fragments and best guesses and theoretical frameworks? And if we're going to tell stories before sleep, why not tell true stories? Or at least stories that try to be true, stories about real people who lived in real cities and pressed real marks into real clay, even if the specific content of those marks, the claim that kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, strains our credulity and challenges our categories, because maybe that challenge is valuable. Maybe we need stories that don't quite make sense, that resist our interpretive frameworks, that remind us that reality is stranger and more various than our theories can capture. And the Void Era is exactly that kind of story. It's weird enough to be interesting, but not so weird that we dismiss it entirely. It occupies that perfect middle ground where we have to take it seriously while also recognizing its strangeness. And in that middle ground, in that space of engaged puzzlement, something interesting happens. We become more aware of our own assumptions, more conscious of the frameworks we use to make sense of the world, more humble about the limits of our understanding. And those are good qualities to take into sleep. That awareness, that consciousness, that humility. They create a receptive state, an openness to possibility, a willingness to let go of certainty and drift into the ambiguous realm of dreams where time works differently, where past and present blend together, where impossible things happen with perfect normalcy. And maybe that's why ancient chronologies make such good bedtime material, because they already operate according to dream logic. They're already mixing history and mythology, already treating time as malleable rather than fixed, already doing in the waking world what our sleeping minds do every night. And so the transition is smooth, natural. There's no jarring shift between the content and the state of mind it's inducing, between the strangeness of the void era and the strangeness of dreams. They're compatible, they speak the same language, and as you fall asleep, the boundary between them dissolves. And you might dream of clay tablets and impossible kings, or you might dream of something entirely different. But either way, you'll have spent your transition time thinking about deep things, about time and meaning and human attempts to understand origins. And even if you don't remember any of the specific details when you wake up, even if the whole thing fades into the general blur of half-remembered content from the night before, something will remain, some subtle shift in perspective, some opening of awareness, some appreciation for the strangeness of the past and the human capacity to create meaning even in the face of enormous temporal and cultural distance. And that's not nothing, that's actually quite valuable. That capacity for connection across time, that willingness to engage with people who thought differently than we do, who organized their reality according to different principles, who counted years in ways we find baffling. And if this video has helped facilitate that engagement, if it's helped you think about the void era even for a moment, even as you drift away from conscious thought, then it's accomplished something worthwhile. something that justifies the time we've spent together discussing cuneiform tablets and scholarly debates and the various interpretations of impossible chronologies, because the alternative is to dismiss the Void Era entirely, to write it off as ancient nonsense not worth our attention, and that would be a loss, not just for our understanding of Sumerian civilization but for our understanding of human possibility, of the range of ways that people have tried to make sense of time and history and origins. And every time we dismiss ancient thinking as primitive or confused or simply wrong, we impoverish ourselves, we narrow our sense of what's possible, we reinforce the assumption that our way of knowing is the only valid way, when in fact it's just one way among many, and the Sumerians had their way, and the Hindus had theirs, and the Maya had theirs, and Indigenous Australian peoples had theirs, and all these different temporal frameworks, all these different ways of organizing the past and relating it to the present, they're all part of the human heritage. They all belong to us if we're willing to engage with them seriously, to learn from them even when we don't accept them, to let them expand our sense of possibility rather than using them as foils to demonstrate our own superiority. And I think the Void Era, for all its strangeness, has something to teach us about time, about how we measure it and think about it and structure our lives according to it, because our own temporal frameworks aren't natural or inevitable, they're constructed, they're choices we've made, and other choices are possible, other ways of relating to time are viable, and the fact that the Sumerians chose to structure their prehistory according to enormous antediluvian reigns doesn't make them wrong or primitive, it makes them different, and difference is valuable. Difference is instructive. Difference helps us see our own assumptions more clearly by showing us what happens when people make different assumptions, and if we approach the Void Era in that spirit, as an opportunity to learn rather than a problem to solve, as a window into alternative temporal frameworks rather than an error to correct, then we might actually get somewhere with it. We might actually understand something about what the Sumerians were trying to do with their chronology, what work it was performing in their culture, what needs it was serving, and that understanding enriches us, makes us more aware, more thoughtful, more appreciative of human cognitive diversity and the many ways that different cultures have organized their understanding of reality, time being one of the most fundamental aspects of that understanding, the framework within which everything else happens. And so chronology isn't just dry academic material, it's actually deeply philosophical, deeply human, deeply important. And the Void Era, with its impossible numbers and its resistance to our categories, is forcing us to think about these deep issues, is making us work for our understanding, and that work is valuable. That effort matters, even if we never arrive at a definitive answer, even if the question of how long the Void Era lasted remains forever open, because the process of engaging with the question, of thinking through the possibilities, of wrestling with ancient texts and modern interpretations, that process is what transforms us. That's what makes history worth studying, not the answers but the questions, not the certainties but the uncertainties, not the resolved but the irresolvable. And if you've stayed with me this far, if you're still listening, or if you've already drifted off, but some part of your mind is still processing these words, then you've participated in that process. You've engaged with the Void Era and let it work on you. Let it challenge your assumptions and expand your sense of temporal possibility. And that's more than enough. That's all we can really hope for from a bedtime history video about ancient Mesopotamian chronology, that it sparks thought and induces sleep in roughly equal measure, that it's interesting enough to hold attention but relaxing enough to facilitate drift, that it takes seriously both the academic content and the soporific purpose, treating them not as contradictory but as complementary, because knowledge and rest aren't opposed. Thinking and sleeping aren't enemies. We can learn while we relax. We can engage while we let go. We can be serious and drowsy simultaneously. And if this video has found that balance, if it's managed to be both informative and soporific, both rigorous and relaxing, then I'm satisfied. And you should be drifting off now, should be letting go of whatever you're still holding on to, whether it's thoughts about the Void Era or thoughts about your day, or thoughts about whatever's worrying you in your life, because none of it matters as much as you think it does, not from the perspective of deep time, not when you measure it against 28,800-year reigns and 241 200-year chronologies and civilizations that rose and fell and left only fragments behind, and you're just one person living one life in one moment of an unfathomably long history. And that could seem crushing, but it's actually liberating. It means you don't have to carry the weight of the world. You don't have to figure everything out. You don't have to resolve every mystery. You can just be here now, in this moment, in this darkness, letting go, releasing control, trusting that sleep will come and dreams will come and morning will come, and all the questions will still be there tomorrow if you want to pursue them. All the mysteries will remain. All the ancient tablets will continue sitting in museums waiting for someone to read them and puzzle over them and try to make sense of their impossible claims. And maybe you'll be part of that tradition. Maybe you'll contribute something to our understanding of the Void Era, or maybe you won't. Maybe you'll forget everything you've heard tonight and move on to other concerns. And that's fine too. That's completely acceptable, because the Void Era has survived 4,000 years. It can survive being forgotten by you. It's patient. It can wait. It's been waiting this long. What's a few more years or decades or centuries? Time means nothing to clay tablets. They exist outside the time they record, monuments to the human drive to preserve and communicate and make meaning, and they'll be there long after we're gone, long after everyone currently alive has died and been forgotten. The tablets will remain. Their cuneiform marks still legible to anyone who learns the language, still transmitting their strange chronologies and impossible reigns, still raising questions about the Void Era and what it means, and how long it lasted. And future historians will debate the same issues we've been debating, will propose new interpretations and critique old ones, will add their voices to the ongoing conversation. And that continuity is beautiful. That's something worth celebrating, the way human inquiry persists across generations, the way questions keep getting asked even when answers remain elusive, the way we keep engaging with the past even though we know we can never fully recover it. And there's something noble about that persistence, that commitment to understanding even in the face of inevitable limitation, and the Void Era deserves that persistence, deserves our ongoing attention, deserves to be remembered and discussed and puzzled over, not because it's important in some grand scheme, but because it's part of our collective human heritage, part of the story of how different peoples at different times have tried to make sense of origins and time and history, and every voice in that story matters. Every attempt to understand counts, including yours, including this moment right now where you're lying in darkness, listening to words about ancient chronology, because you're part of the chain. You're one more link in the transmission. You're helping keep alive the memory of the Void Era and the questions it raises. And even if you forget everything tomorrow, even if this all fades into the background of your memory, something will remain, some trace, some subtle influence on how you think about time and history and the deep past, and that trace will affect your understanding in ways you might never consciously recognize, but it'll be there, shaping your perspective, expanding your sense of what's possible, making you just slightly more aware of the strangeness and diversity of human thought across the millennia. And if thousands of people listen to this video, thousands of people carry that trace, thousands of minds are slightly altered, thousands of perspectives are expanded, and that's impact. That's meaningful. That's why it's worth making bedtime history videos about obscure topics like Sumerian chronology, because the aggregate effect across thousands of listeners is significant. It contributes to a broader public understanding of the ancient world. It makes ancient history slightly more accessible, slightly less intimidating, slightly more connected to ordinary life, and that democratization of knowledge is valuable. It breaks down the walls between academic specialists and interested amateurs. It allows everyone to participate in the conversation about the past, and everyone should participate. Everyone has a right to engage with human history, to wonder about origins, to puzzle over mysteries, to ask questions about the Void Era or any other aspect of our shared past. And the fact that you're here, that you've chosen to spend this time thinking about ancient Mesopotamia, that choice matters. It affirms the value of historical inquiry. It supports the broader project of understanding where we came from. And on that note, on this affirmation of the importance of asking questions even when answers remain elusive, I think we can finally bring this to a close, can finally release you into sleep, can finally stop talking about clay tablets and impossible chronologies and scholarly debates, because we've covered the material, we've explored the question from multiple angles, we've examined the evidence and the interpretations and the implications, and if we still don't know exactly how long the void era lasted, well, that's okay, that's acceptable, that's the nature of ancient history. You do your best with limited evidence and imperfect understanding, and the fact that we can't definitively answer the question doesn't mean the inquiry was worthless, doesn't mean we've wasted our time, because we've learned things along the way, we've thought about issues we wouldn't otherwise have thought about, we've engaged with texts and ideas from a civilization that's been dead for 4,000 years, and that engagement, that willingness to think across vast temporal distances, that's valuable in itself, that's enriching, that's part of what makes us human. And as you drift into sleep, as consciousness fades and dreams begin, you can take comfort in the fact that you've spent this time well. You've engaged with something ancient and strange and wonderful. You've let the void era work on your imagination. This response paused because Claude reached its max length for a message. Hit continue to nudge Claude along. Continue. Allowed it to loosen the grip of the present and gently widen your sense of time. And now there's nothing left to do but rest. Let the names of ancient kings fade into indistinct echoes. Let the numbers stretch and blur until they lose all sharp edges, until they're no longer figures to be understood but rhythms to drift with. The tablets can wait. The debates can wait. Time itself can wait. For now, there's only this quiet moment, this slow descent into sleep, where past and present dissolve into something soft and unstructured. Breathe, release, and let the void era recede into darkness, patient, unresolved, and perfectly at peace.